that she was 31 years old, and she owned nothing in the world but the clothes on her back, a carpet bag with a broken clasp, that and $11.40 she had earned scrubbing other women's floors on her hands and knees for the better part of 3 years. The man who had taken everything else, her house, her father's land, her mother's quilting frame, that in 19 years of her own quiet obedience, was the man she had called husband, and when he decided she was no longer useful to him, he had simply handed her a paper signed by a judge he had known since boyhood, and told her to go. She went. That. She walked out of Nora Voss's house in the eastern Kansas town of Caldwell Crossing on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1887, and she did not look back, that because she had learned long before, that looking back at things that would not return was a particular kind of cruelty a person did only to themselves. She had $11.40, and she spent 9 of it on a building that had not had a door on its hinges in 4 years. It was the old Prater Saloon on the south edge of a dying town called Ember Flats, 40 miles west of where her life had ended, and she bought it from a county tax office clerk who could not believe she was serious and told her so twice. She was serious. Most people who saw the transaction, the crumbling facade, the warped pine boards, the dark interior that smelled of mouse and old whiskey, called it the act of a woman who had lost her mind along with her circumstances. What none of them knew, and what we are here to tell you, is that sealed, inside the wall behind that rotting bar counter, was something that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades, something that would not only restore Nora Voss to herself, but would bring a quiet and permanent justice down upon the men who had kept an entire county in the dark. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Voss. If you have ever stood inside a place that the world has given up on and felt, somehow, that it was not finished, leave us a word in the comments, because this story was written for you. Nora had not always been a woman with $11. There had been a time, not so long ago as it felt, that when she had been a girl in a house full of warmth and industry, in a family that understood the value of careful hands and patient work. Her father, Clement Aldridge, had come to Kansas from Tennessee in 1861 with 2 mules, a young wife named Beulah, and a philosophy of life so simple it barely required words to express it. That a thing worth having was worth building slowly, and that whatever you built with your own hands could never truly be taken from you. He was wrong about the second part, that as it turned out, but the first part stayed with Nora her entire life, buried in her the way certain seeds bury themselves in soil and wait for years before they decide to become something. That Clement ran a dry goods operation out of a converted barn on the eastern edge of their property, and Beulah kept a kitchen garden so precise and productive that women came from 4 farms over to ask her about it. Nora was the second of 3 children, and she occupied that particular middle child position of watching everything without being watched quite as carefully in return, which meant she had the freedom to learn. She followed her father through the store inventory on winter mornings, watching him move his thumb down columns of figures in the ledger with the same focused attention another man might give a chessboard. She watched her mother preserve, negotiate, plan, and quietly solve every domestic crisis that arose without ever letting on that a crisis had been occurring at all. She was 12 years old when her older brother Silas got sick. Scarlet did not get well, and she understood then that though she had no words for it at the time, that the organizing principle of her family's life was not happiness but endurance. That happiness was the thing that sometimes happened while you were busy enduring. That. What she learned from her father that mattered most was not the numbers themselves, but the habit of recording. Clement Aldridge believed that unwritten things were essentially unreal, that a transaction not set down in ink was a transaction that had never happened, and he passed this belief to Nora with such consistency and repetition that by the time she was 15, that she could reconstruct a month's worth of accounts from memory and find errors in a ledger the way some people find errors in a piece of music. Not by checking each note deliberately, but by feeling where the harmony broke. That she could read a column of figures and know in her chest, before she knew it in her mind, when something in them was false. She also learned to sew, to plaster, to negotiate with suppliers who underestimated her, and to read contracts more carefully than the men who wrote them, which was a skill she would later wish she had practiced even more rigorously. Her mother taught her these things without calling them skills, the same way you might teach a child to swim without calling it swimming, by simply placing her in water and staying close enough to catch her if she went under. By the time she was 19, Nora Aldridge was one of those young women who other young women studied quietly and envied without meaning to. Not for her looks, which were pleasant but not remarkable, but for a certain quality of stillness she carried, that a sense that she was not waiting for her life to begin, but was already living it with full attention. She had her father's ledger sense and her mother's practical grace, and she could have done something particular with those qualities if the world she lived in had been the kind of world that allowed women to do particular things on their own terms. It was not, of course, that kind of world. That Harlan Voss was 34 when he came to ask Clement Aldridge for his daughter's hand, and at 20 Nora was too young and too trusting of her father's judgment to weigh what she was agreeing to against what she was giving up. That Harlan was not a cruel man in the beginning. He was careful the way certain cold things are careful. He did not move against you all at once. He had land, a house in town, a reputation in Caldwell Crossing that stood on a foundation of handshakes and public generosity, and he presented himself to Nora's parents as a man of substance and good character. Clement Aldridge shook his hand and looked satisfied. That and Beulah wept a little at the wedding in the way mothers do when they are proud and frightened simultaneously and cannot separate the two feelings enough to know which one is louder. Nora went to live in Harlan's house, and for the first 2 years she told herself the unease she felt in her stomach on quiet evenings was simply the ordinary difficulty of becoming someone's wife. She kept the house with the same meticulous care she had seen in her mother. She managed the household accounts with a precision that surprised Harlan and that he praised at first. She tried to be useful in ways that were visible and in ways that were not, and for a time she believed the life she was living was enough because she had not yet fully understood that enough and sufficient were not the same thing. It was in the 3rd year that Harlan began making financial decisions she could not account for. Money moved through the household in ways that did not follow the logic of their income or their expenses, and when she asked about it, not accusingly but in the careful conversational way she had learned to manage difficult questions, Harlan looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something flat and distant, the way a door looks when it has been locked from the inside. He told her the accounts were not her concern. He told her this more than once, with increasing specificity, until one morning she woke to find that her name had been quietly removed from the deed to their property, that a man named Ira Dunmore at the county recorder's office had processed the change 3 months earlier, when she went to ask Ira Dunmore about it, he looked at her with that same flat, locked expression and told her the matter was settled and she should speak to her husband. Her parents were gone by then. Clement died of a lung condition in the spring of 1882, and Beulah followed him the following winter, which Nora had always privately believed was less a medical event than a decision her mother had made, the way certain people decide that one chapter is finished and do not bother to open the next. Their property went to Harlan through a provision in the will that Clement had signed in the last weeks of his life. When his clarity came and went like weather, that in which Nora had not been present to witness or question, she spent 3 years trying to find a foothold in her own life. She took in laundry, she sewed, she cleaned houses whose owners she had once considered neighbors. She saved money with the same quiet discipline her father had practiced with his ledger, setting aside coins and small bills with a consistency that felt, in its worst moments, more like stubbornness than hope. She told no one what she was saving for because she did not know yet. She only knew that money was a kind of language, and that a woman without any of it had no voice in the world she was living in. When Harlan finally presented her with the divorce papers, the judge's signature clean and official, the whole affair arranged with such efficiency that it suggested significant planning. She accepted them with a steadiness that surprised him, she did not cry, she did not argue. She looked at the papers, noted the date and the notarization, folded them carefully, and placed them in her carpetbag next to her savings. She had $11.40. She walked out the door. She heard about Ember Flats from a woman named Rosalie Crane who ran a boarding house in the next town over and who had a habit of collecting information about abandoned and undervalued things the way other women collected pressed flowers. Rosalie told her over a breakfast of cold cornbread and black coffee that there was a dying cattle town 40 miles west with a saloon nobody wanted and a tax bill that had gone unpaid for 4 years, and that the county was looking to get whatever it could for the property before it fell through completely. The number Rosalie quoted was so low it sounded like a misprint. It was $9. Nora finished her coffee, asked two specific questions, the name of the county clerk and the condition of the building's exterior walls, and then she folded her napkin and walked to the livery and arranged passage west. That the town of Ember Flats was not dying so much, as it was already several steps past dying and simply had not accepted the fact yet. The main street held 8 buildings in varying stages of defeat. A feed store that still operated 2 days a week, a post office staffed by a man named Otis Pell, who seemed to regard incoming mail as a personal imposition, a church with no congregation, and a minister who came by on occasional Sundays more out of obligation than faith. And 3 private homes, in which the remaining permanent population of Ember Flats passed their days in the particular combination of stubbornness and inertia that characterized people who had decided to stay somewhere long after the reason for staying had packed up and left. The old Prater Saloon stood at the south end of the main street, with the ruined dignity of a building that had once been the loudest place in a loud town and was now the quietest place in a quiet one. The door was missing. The front window had been boarded over with planks that had subsequently warped and split. The sign, Prater's, in letters that had once been painted red, had faded to a color that was somewhere between rust and grief. Nora stood in front of it for a long moment, her carpet bag on the ground beside her, and looked at it the way her father had once looked, at a piece of land before he bought it, not at what it was, but at what it had been built to do. The county clerk, a small man named Garrett Fitch, who wore his hat indoors, and had the look of someone who had never in his life been surprised, processed her $9 with the expression of a man completing a transaction he expected to regret by morning. He handed her a deed. He said, in a tone that managed to be both helpful and dismissive, that the place had last been occupied by one Silas Prater, who had died under unspecified circumstances in the winter of 1869, and whose estate had never been properly settled. He said the building was structurally questionable. He said she would need to address the outstanding property taxes, which amounted to approximately 60 cents per year for 4 years. She paid the $2.40 from her remaining funds. She now had no money. She had a deed. She walked into the Prater Saloon for the first time, with the afternoon light falling through the missing door at a low, golden angle, and she stood still for several minutes to let her eyes adjust and to let the space introduce itself to her. It was a single long room. The bar counter ran the length of the back wall. Dark pine, scarred and water-stained but solid in a way she could feel when she pressed her palm against it, the way old wood is solid, not in spite of its age, but because of it. Behind the bar, the wall had been paneled in pine boards that had once been painted white and were now the color of old cream. 3 shelves ran the length of the wall where bottles had stood. A staircase along the right wall led to a loft that had probably served as the proprietor's sleeping quarters. The floorboards were thick and held, though they spoke loudly with every step. The ceiling was intact. This surprised her, and she noted it with the same gratitude she had learned to apply to all small mercies. Quietly, without excess, she spent the first 2 days cleaning. She had nothing to clean with except waters. She hauled from a pump behind the building, and rags she tore from a dress she could no longer wear for its original purpose. And she worked from the ceiling down, the way her mother had taught her. Because there was no sense in cleaning the floor while the ceiling was still dropping its history onto everything below. On the 3rd morning she found the crack. It ran along the lower section of the back wall, behind the bar counter, starting about a foot from the floor and traveling upward, and to the left in the irregular pattern that old walls develop when they have been settling for years. She had seen the crack the first day and marked it without attending to it. On the 3rd morning, running her cleaning cloth along the baseboard, she noticed that the crack, where it reached a certain point about 2 feet from the ground, did not have the dusty stillness of a crack in a solid wall. There was air moving through it. Very little air, barely enough to feel against a wet fingertip held at the right angle, but air nonetheless, which meant there was space behind the paneling. She pressed the panel. It did not move. She pressed it in 3 other places, working along the wall behind the bar, and when she reached a point about 4 feet to the left of the first crack, she felt the panel give. Not much, perhaps 1/4 of an inch, with a sound that was less a creak than a whisper. She stepped back. that she looked at the wall the way her father had looked at ledgers when he sensed something in them that did not add up. Then she went to look for a tool, that the only implement she could find that served her purpose was a length of iron bar she discovered in the alley behind the building, left behind by some long-departed purpose. She used it carefully. She was not pulling apart but opening, that the way you open a letter, with the sense that what was inside had waited long enough to be read and deserved some consideration in the reading. The panel came free in sections. Behind it was a cavity in the wall, roughly 2 feet wide and 4 feet tall, that framed by the original exterior boards and the back of the paneling, a small dark room within a room that the paneling had been installed specifically to conceal. Inside the cavity, that wrapped in oilskin that had done its job admirably well for nearly 2 decades, were 3 things: a leather satchel, a stack of documents tied with twine, and a glass jar sealed with wax that contained, as she would discover, that $114 in paper currency and coin. She sat on the floor of the saloon for a long time with these things arranged in front of her and did not touch them. Then she untied the twine. The documents were in 2 categories. That the first was a set of personal letters addressed to a woman named Constance Prater, who Nora understood from context to be the wife of the saloon's previous owner, Silas Prater. The letters were from Constance's brother, a man named Edmund Hale, who had apparently lived in the town before his departure and who wrote with the careful, controlled language of a person composing documents intended to serve a double purpose: to communicate and to survive as evidence if the need arose. That the second category of documents was not personal at all. It was a ledger. Nora had grown up with ledgers. She knew how they worked and what they meant, and, more importantly, she knew the specific, that unmistakable quality of a ledger that had been altered. The slight variations in ink pressure, the erasure ghosts, the way certain numbers sat slightly higher or lower than the line because they had been written over something else. That she had learned to feel falsehood in a column of figures before she could articulate where the falsehood lived. That, and she felt it now within the first 3 pages of this particular ledger, with such force that she set the book down and pressed both hands flat on the floor and breathed. The ledger belonged to the Ember Flats Land Consolidation Company, that a concern she had never heard of and which, from the dates in the ledger, had operated between 1865 and 1871. It recorded land transactions, purchases, transfers, and registrations covering nearly 4,000 acres of the surrounding territory. Then it was from the 3rd page forward comprehensively falsified, not carelessly, with skill, with patience, and with the clear intention of creating a documented record that would justify a series of land seizures that had apparently been carried out without legal basis, that performed on behalf of a small group of men whose names appeared with regularity as principals and recipients of the fraudulent transactions. Edmund Hale's letters explained the rest. He had been a clerk for the company, had discovered what was being done, that had copied the ledger, every page, with annotations, before the original was presumably destroyed, and had given the copy and the letters to his sister Constance in Ember Flats for safekeeping, intending to bring the matter before a territorial court. That he had left town before he was able to do so. His letters stopped in December of 1869. Silas Prater, Constance's husband, had died in the winter of 1869. Constance had apparently left Ember Flats soon after, leaving the documents sealed in the wall. That the names in the ledger included the name of the county recorder, Ira Dunmore, and they included the name of Nora Voss. Nora sat with this information for 3 days. She did not rush. She read every letter twice, then a 3rd time. That she went through the ledger page by page, translating its falsifications into plain language. In a second document she wrote in her own careful hand, that cross-referencing dates and parcels and names, until she had produced a summary that any literate person could follow without needing to be a bookkeeper. That she considered what she was doing and what it would cost her, and what it would cost the people whose land had been taken, whose families had been moved off their own ground by paperwork that had been constructed to look legitimate and was not. That she thought about Constance Prater, who had trusted a wall with this secret and then left, and about Edmund Hale, who had done a brave and careful thing and then disappeared into silence. And she thought about her father's voice saying that unwritten things were essentially unreal. Meaning, she now understood that written things were real and real things could be used. She walked to the post office on the 4th day and asked Otis Pell, that in a tone that indicated she already knew the answer, where the nearest federal land office was. He told her. She asked who the sitting federal marshal for the district was. He told her that too, looking at her with an expression she recognized. The flat, that assessing look of a man trying to determine how much a woman understood about what she was asking. She thanked him pleasantly and walked back to the saloon. It was the following Thursday when she walked into the office of Sheriff Aldous Cray, in the county seat of Merriam, Kansas, with her summary document in one hand and the original ledger in the other, and asked to speak with him about a matter of fraudulent land registration spanning roughly 4,000 acres and 19 years. Sheriff Cray was a man who had spent his career in a county where certain names were not questioned, and he sat behind his desk with the particular stillness of a man trying to determine which direction a situation was going before he committed to a response. He reached for the ledger. He opened it. He read for perhaps 4 minutes. Then he looked up at Nora Voss with an expression she had not seen on a man's face in a very long time. Something she recognized, after a moment, that is the specific look of a person who has just understood that they are in the presence of something they cannot dismiss or manage or redirect. He did not speak for a long while. When he did speak, it was to say, very quietly, that he would need to send for the federal marshal. She said she expected he would, and that she had taken the liberty of writing to the federal land office in Topeka the previous Monday, and that she anticipated a response within the week. She laid her summary document on his desk with a small, definitive sound. She told him she would be at the old Prater Saloon in Ember Flats if he or the marshal needed to speak with her, and that she was restoring the building and expected to be occupied with that work for the foreseeable future. The sheriff said nothing as she left. The silence behind her was of a particular quality. Not the silence of a room with nothing in it, but the silence of a room in which something that had been standing for a long time had just discovered it was no longer standing. Harlan Voss was arrested on a Tuesday in November, 41 days after Nora walked out of his house with $11.40. Ira Dunmore, the county recorder, was arrested the same morning. 2 other men named in the ledger, a land speculator named Claude Fenwick and a bank officer named Thomas Reed, were summoned before a federal examiner before the end of the month. The legal proceedings were slow, as such things always were, and the full untangling of the fraudulent transfers took the better part of 2 years. But the ledger was clear and the annotations were meticulous, and Edmund Hale, who turned out to be alive and living in Colorado under a different name after nearly 2 decades of careful quiet, came forward when he received a letter that Nora had written him through a chain of 3 forwarding addresses. She had pieced together from his letters to his sister. He wept when he arrived in Ember Flats and saw the building that had kept his secret. The $114 in the jar had been Constance Prater's emergency savings, and Nora used it exactly as she believed Constance would have wanted it used. On materials for the saloon's restoration, not as a drinking establishment but as a gathering place, the kind of room a small community uses to do the collective work of being a community. She plastered walls. She rehung the door. She commissioned new shutters from a carpenter in Merriam who needed the work and was grateful for the detail she specified, because she believed that things worth building were worth building with attention. When the federal land restitution process began returning parcels to the families from whom they had been taken by fraudulent registration, it was in the rebuilt saloon of Ember Flats that the meetings were held. The documents witnessed, and the quiet, unglamorous work of restoration conducted. Nora did not profit personally from the discovery. She was asked, more than once, whether she intended to pursue a legal claim of her own against Harlan Voss and the others. She said she did not, which surprised people. What she wanted and what she received was the deed to $9 worth of crumbling pine and old memory, at the south end of a street in a town that had decided, against considerable evidence, not to be finished yet. She wanted the building. She wanted to finish what she had started with it. She wanted to be useful in a place that needed something she was capable of giving. She stayed. Let us go back to where we began. To a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1887, to a woman with a broken carpet bag and $11.40 walking out a door she had decided would be the last door anyone else would close behind her. We did not tell you then what we can tell you now, that the $11 were not what she had. What she had was 31 years of watching, recording, enduring, and understanding that the world's indifference to a woman's capabilities was not evidence that those capabilities did not exist. That what she had was her father's belief in the reality of written things and her mother's belief in the sufficiency of careful work. What she had was a quality of stillness that looked, to people who didn't understand it, like resignation, that and was in fact its precise opposite. The Prater Saloon in Ember Flats stood for another 40 years after Nora Voss bought it for $9 on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1887. People in the territory called it the Aldridge Building by 1892, that because Nora had quietly returned to her father's name. The building served as a meeting hall, a schoolroom, a place where the families whose land had been returned came to sit together and remember that they had been wronged and had been heard, that which is not the same as being made whole but is the beginning of the road that leads there. Nora lived in the loft above the bar. She kept a ledger. Every transaction, every meeting, that every small and large piece of business conducted within those restored walls was written down in her careful hand, because she had learned that unwritten things were essentially unreal, and she intended for everything that happened in that building to be very real indeed. She was 31 years old when she arrived in Ember Flats with nothing, and she was much older when she left it, and she spent the years in between doing what the women she had learned from had always done, building slowly, carefully, with full attention, and trusting that the thing worth having was also worth the waiting. We hope that story found you tonight in the right way, at the right moment. Stories like Nora's have a way of arriving when we need them, and we are grateful every time someone chooses to sit with us for a little while and listen. If this one moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the things the world overlooks are not necessarily without value. They are sometimes the most important things the world possesses, waiting behind a wall for the right pair of hands to find them. We read every one of your comments, and we love hearing which part of a story settled into you. For this one, we want to ask you, what is something in your own life that others wrote off as worthless, that you somehow knew was worth more than the price the world put on it? Leave us that story in the comments. If you're willing, we would genuinely like to know. Thank you for being here tonight, for your patience and your attention and the quiet company you keep with us each time you press play. Until next time, stay close.